Okay, I got into.
Somebody's coming in.
All right.
Yeah.
Can I go ahead and begin now? Oh. Okay, can I begin? Well, continuing then. I got into this because I was a very sickly child. By the time I reached 12, I had developed a peritonitis, which is a perforated and bleeding intestine that was misdiagnosed as appendicitis. And they took it out anyway, and that's the way the medical profession thinks, in case it caused me problems in the future. And if the medical profession doesn't know why the particular organ or gland exists, it isn't necessary. So, but the appendix is a gland or an organ that is a library. It stores all of the information that is collected from every foreign body that's ever entered the body, any pollution, anything that's entered the body. The pancreas, the appendix registers it, and so when that piece of whatever it is enters your body again, your body can respond within an hour and 20 minutes. Take care of it. If you don't have an appendix, it can take up to 36 hours for your body analyzes and decides what to do with it the best for the whole of the body. So an appendix is a very important gland. I was born into a very violent household. I had a brother who was 18 months older than I and never forgave me for having been born. Coming home when he was still in diapers, I took the attention away like that, and it unnerved him forever until he went into the Vietnam War at 16 years old and I was 15. So then I got some respite from it. My father was also a very violent man, put me in the hospital many times. Always said I fell downstairs, that's what my mom would say, to the hospital and the doctors. When I was 18 months old, because my brother was so violent, he would push me on rakes and rusty nails, anything that was dangerous like that, because he knew my mother would take me for a shot. And he discovered after the first tetanus shot when I was 3 months old that I reacted very badly to it for weeks. On the third one at 18 months old, it went to my brain, my communication center, and I became autistic, developmentally autistic. So I could never relate to language after that. I was 8 years old before I had learned to parrot language. So I would throw back words that I heard at home. And in a violent household, you don't hear nice words. Shut up, sit down, go to hell, things like that. So that's what I was throwing back at the nuns and priests in school. And of course, that didn't win me any brownie buttons. So I was constantly getting punished, and I was just talking like my family talked, and it didn't work, obviously. And the way I got to schools was always pick the smartest, most sensitive girl to sit next to, and I would copy her hieroglyphs, because that's all it was to me. It was designs. Maybe a great artist. So something came of that. And then when I hit 15 and a half, I developed diabetes, juvenile diabetes, that I would have to take it forever. And then by the time I was 19 years old, I developed a stomach ulcer. Now in school, all through, like I said, I cheated my way through, and that's how I got to C's and D's. And when I got out of high school, my mother put me in a technical school. What she did was she took my brother that was violent with me to this new technical school called a computer programming in unit wiring school, and they didn't give you the normal tests. They didn't give you comprehension tests, English comprehension, reading comprehension, or anything. They wanted to know your geometric and mathematical abilities. And I always excelled in that. That was the only place I didn't cheat, and I was always accused of cheating because I didn't have to write out the formula. I could just write out the answer. And that's with a lot of autistic children. So when they took me to this pre-computer programming school, they put a program in front of me to write a problem, and I could write it in a couple of hours when it would take other people months to write. So the teachers or the professors of that new technical university knew what they had, so they farmed me out. They always farmed me out with a person who went with me to do all the writing and all the talking. So I mean, here I was, an idiot making a fortune. You know, in computer programming, I was farmed out to Carte Blanche Corporation, which was then the biggest credit card company. It was bought by Avco. So, and I transferred out to Los Angeles and also with big trucking companies, like the third largest in the world, Time DC. So I was making a lot of money, but to keep mobile, because I had chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia since that episode in the hospital with the peritonitis, they injected me every few hours with something, either an antibiotic or a painkiller, but they were shooting me every few hours, and ever since that I had fibromyalgia. I had slight bouts of fibromyalgia because I would hold colds and flus for 2 to 3 months at a time. Even a couple of years it was 5 months, and I was bedridden for almost that much a year. So it peaked after that peritonitis incident when I was 12. So the way I kept going was I'd sneak down in the morning, you know, bundle with my blankets and everything because I couldn't stand the cold, and I would drink coffee, cold coffee from the day before, just to get me going. So I was drinking 11 cups of coffee a day, smoking 2 packs of cigarettes, all to keep my energy going. So when I was 19, you know, to get to sleep, after a long period of that, to get to sleep, I had to start drinking alcohol, so I became an alcoholic. I drank a fifth of gin a night, or bourbon, to get to sleep. Also, I ate lots of donuts and sugar, and because I worked for a trucking company off and on, I could get Benzedrine from the truck drivers to stay awake. So I was doing all kinds of drugs like that. So I developed an ulcer at 19. And then the remedy for that, according to the medical profession, was Maalox, which is, you know, like eating dolomite or, you know, chalk, and just liquid chalk, just to absorb all the acids, so that hopefully the ulcer would heal, clot. And it didn't. Instead, it formed into a tumor. So a tumor formed right next to the ulcer. So they decided they had to go in and perform surgery. So I had all the vagus nerve severed to my stomach, so I would no longer secrete hydrochloric acid. They put me in the category of octogenarians who do not secrete hydrochloric acid. And they said that if I ate anything raw in my life, I would be in danger of bacterial and parasitical invasion, and my life would be in danger. So nothing raw. If I ate an apple, it had to be baked, or a candy apple. Can you imagine? They're telling me I have to eat a candy apple rather than a fresh apple. And what kind of nutrient value do you think I'm going to get in that? But I didn't know any better. You know, I was still autistic. I didn't know what the hell they were saying. I just was following, you know, the instructions as far as what they were showing me on the chart. And so I ate everything cooked, and, you know, I enjoyed my cereal, and I loved my half gallon of pasteurized 2% blue milk. And do you know what they do to that blue milk to make it white now? They've got mountains of dolomite, and they shovel it into the milk, and that's why it's no longer blue. In the 60s, and it was blue, remember? I don't know if anybody remembers. So now they shovel dolomite into it. And do you know how they fortify it with vitamin D? They take hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is the same molecular structure as plastic, and they subject it to radiation, usually radioactive material. And that's your vitamin D. And the FDA allows them to call that vitamin D. It's nowhere near vitamin D. It doesn't even look like that vitamin D. It doesn't react like vitamin D. But some chemists said, well, vitamin D is just fat that's been transformed into a different substance called vitamin D that's absorbed and helps you use calcium and build bones. So they said, okay, light, radiation, fat, we can do that. And that's what they do. So it has nothing to do with generating health. In fact, in the experiments where animals were fed the fortified vitamin D, pasteurized, homogenized milk, they got the same diseases as those that were not homogenized. I mean, they were homogenized and pasteurized without being fortified. So the vitamin D wasn't helpful. Their version of vitamin D wasn't helpful at all. So here I was in a state where I was supposed to eat everything cooked, and I mostly did that anyway. I did like my apples. But mostly I was a donut fiend, and I loved RC Cola. And, you know, well, how else would anybody get an ulcer by drinking 11 cups a day and Benzedrine and smoking and all of that? Of course, I'm bound to get sick. So when they cut out the tumor, did all of that, I was vomiting all the time, couldn't keep anything down. I couldn't drink alcohol anymore, so that destroyed my ability to sleep. I still drank all the coffee to stay awake and to function. I still took the Benzedrines, and then I found myself unable to sleep. Then the surgery, the incision turned tumorous, and it got as high as 3/4 of an inch and as wide as 1.5 inches in some places. So they said, oh, we have to irradiate that. And, you know, I was raised by a nurse and a scientist father, you know, who was an inventor, and 3 uncles who were doctors, and 8 RNs, uncles and aunts. So I was raised around the medical profession. You always respected them and you did what they say. So I went along with everything. So they irradiated me, and they gave me so much irradiation in 10 weeks that they cauterized my spine, which means it's like taking malleable clay, putting it into a kiln and firing it at cone 10. So what happens with clay? It's nice and malleable. After you fire it, it's rock. It's pottery. It's porcelain, whatever kind of, you know, depending upon the element of clay that you're utilizing to fire. So I was paralyzed from the pectorals down, and then that also gave me blood and bone cancer, the radiation therapy. So then they said, oh, well, we're going to have to give you chemotherapy. You have a 1% chance of living, and maybe we can make your life a little longer. They didn't talk about quality or anything like that. I wouldn't have understood anyway, but they certainly didn't tell me about quality of life. By the time I finished the chemotherapy, 3 months of chemotherapy, I was complete invalid. I couldn't even crawl on the floor very well, so I have to defecate and urinate in bottles and pans. And of course, many times it was too painful and I couldn't get on it. So I had, like I said, I made a lot of money. So I had a little small 2-bedroom house in Beverly Hills, and I was living on the living room wood floor, defecating, urinating all over myself. I refused to go to the hospice because, you know, again, I couldn't talk except for bad things that I had heard from my family. I was still repeating the same kind of stuff. So I refused to go to the hospice. So 2 volunteers agreed to come into my home 2 and 3 times a week and shop for me, make food for me, and they clean the house. And boy, they had a lot to clean. And I was laying, sometimes up to 3 days I was laying in my urine and defecation. So the house was reeking. So all the furniture had to be destroyed by the time a few months went by. Well, this one African-American kid, 18 years old, making a lot of money as a singer for the Going Thing, which is a group that was hired by Ford Motor Company to go around singing about the better idea in the late 60s and early 70s. He said to me, he said, you know what you need to do is you need to drink a lot of carrot juice and raw milk. So, didn't mean anything to me. I hated carrots. Never had a raw carrot in my life. My mother overcooked everything, so food was atrocious. I was forced to sit an hour to an hour and a half after everybody left the dinner table because I would projectile vomit vegetables. Literally, I could hit that wall with Brussels sprouts. And it was uncontrollable. So they would always keep adding it to my plate if I vomited. So I had to sit there and I had to learn how to cut off my senses. It took time, sometimes 5 minutes between bites. I learned to use a half a teaspoon to a whole teaspoon of milk because I only got 1 glass per meal, just to work it down. So that was hour to an hour and a half every night. That meant 2 hours at the table altogether every night. While everybody else went to watch the new TV, this little bitty TV all in black and white. You know, so that's what it was back then. So I just didn't develop very well. I hated food, and when you mentioned carrots, I knew what carrots were. I knew that sound. I had the image of what a carrot was, and I didn't want it, but he convinced me just to try it. Tasted good, because after you've had chemo and radiation, everything tastes like postage stamps and cardboard. Not a very appetizing diet. So the carrot juice and the raw milk tasted very, very good. And guess what? A week after drinking the milk, I didn't have to take insulin anymore. 1 week, my juvenile diabetes was gone from drinking the raw milk. And they told me I would have to take it for the rest of my life, which would have been a $1,200 to $1,400 a month habit. That's what they want. That's what they want. They want my money. They don't want me healthy. They want my money. So I realized, as I was getting better progressively, just by doing those, consuming the milk and carrot juice, that food had something to do with health. So I began studying. Within 2 weeks of drinking the carrot juice and milk, my autism shut off. I was able to comprehend. I woke and said, oh, language. Oh, that's what a verb is. That's what a preposition is. That's what a noun is. Oh, okay. And I got really excited, so I called my uncle who was studying for his doctorate. He was a TA at UCLA, psychology department, studying for a doctorate in psychology. He was the one who was helping me in Los Angeles when I moved out there at 19, because he understood my problems. And I called him, and I started having a normal conversation with him. He couldn't believe it. He was very excited, and I told him I think it was the carrot juice and the milk, and he said, "Oh no, mine just finally developed." Here I was, almost 22 years old, and just finally able to have a coherent conversation. I mean, if a year and a half I could have had one, I knew language, but from a year and a half to 22, it was impossible for me to have a conversation. So he said, "You're a die-hard Republican asshole. Go read Siddhartha. That's the first thing you should read." It was a small 82-page book. So I called Steve Flanagan, the young boy, who got me to drink the carrot juice and the raw milk. And I said, "Steve," I had conversation. He was shocked, amazed. I said, "Listen, I'd like to go to a bookstore. Could you get me a wheelchair? And we'll go and do it." He said, "I don't know if you can go out, we'll have to put mini diapers on you." And I said, "That's okay, let's do it." So we went to the store, and we spent about 6 hours there. So I was filling the diapers up, stinking the whole the bookstore up. It was a Bodhi Tree bookstore, very spiritual bookstore. And I got all of these books on diet and nutrition. And then I got the book one book on mind over matter, because that sounded good. Who wouldn't like to have mind over matter in the state that I was in? And got Siddhartha. So Siddhartha was the first book that I read, and it was about this young boy who becomes the prodigal son and goes off and experiences being a whoremonger and boozing it and doing everything that we're not supposed to do morally, and then comes back and home and becomes a very spiritual leader. So those concepts were not in my realm of reality. I just had mean, nasty people, around me all the time. So it was a nice introduction into a different reality of nice people. So it took me a full week to read that book. It was like only 82 pages, but I was into the dictionary more than I was into the book, because I look up a word that I didn't know, even the definition. I had to look up the words in the definition to understand the definition, and on and on and on. But I was still excited. I didn't get discouraged by it. So I spent a year and a half studying, mostly an invalid that whole time, severe back pains. I would have to sleep in a bathtub with salt in it and milk, just to make my body buoyant enough so I didn't have all that pressure on my spine. It was extremely painful, headachy painful. I was only able to sleep 10 minutes at a time on the floor, on the couch, or on the bed. And I mostly didn't get on the bed because that was too difficult to get up and down. So I crawled on my elbows on the floor like a worm most of the time for a year and a half, almost 2 years. A lot of 2 years. So as I was getting better, I just started getting more into raw foods, eating a lot more dairy, lots of raw cream, and got a nutritionist to start tutoring me, and he was very pro-raw. In fact, he was probably 70-75% raw foodist, but he was fat phobic. So I just craved butter and I craved raw cream, and they always made me feel the best, but he got all upset. After 3 years of studying with him, I decided I had to go somewhere else. So I'd recovered enough by that point, So I got on a bicycle and traveled all over the North American continent, living with animals and Indian tribes, and just living off the land off of a bicycle. I have a hammock and a sleeping bag, and with 4 saddlebags loaded with physiology, anatomy, biochemistry books. So here I was leaving society because everything I'd read contradicted everything else. So there was nothing good, everything was good, and nothing was good, basically, and you didn't know who to follow. So by that time I had I had committed myself in February '72 to only raw foods. Probably took me to '74 to be completely raw foodist, but when I did that, I lived with a yoga ashram, the Shivananda yoga community, and they got me to be a total vegetarian. And it didn't fare well for me after about 6.5 years. My multiple myeloma came up on me like crazy. Also, they were against too much dairy. A little bit of dairy was okay, and dairy was my lifesaver, raw dairy. So I lived outdoors as a vegetarian, a fruitarian mainly. And of course, it dissolves tissue, dissolves bone and stuff like that. So at the end of that 2.5 years, I was in Alaska at the time, living with the Inuit. I lived with 3 other tribes. I mean, I took my bike all the way down into Yucatan, all the way up to Alaska, across the United States 5 times. Lived with the Yaqui Indians in northern Mexico, the Mayans in the Yucatan, and the Sioux in South Dakota, and the Inuit in Alaska. And in Alaska was my last stop. I was getting weaker and weaker. Of course, even in late August and early September, it was getting cold in Alaska. Their whole spring is a few weeks long, then their summer's a few weeks long, and then they're back in the fall. So their winter is about 6 months. So I was getting very cold. As the temperature dropped down to 50, I was paralyzed with pain in every bone in my body, literally crying pain. So that's what it would be like from about 2:30 in the morning all the way till 6 o'clock in the morning till the sun beat on my sleeping bag. It would take me about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours of the sun beating on my sleeping bag before I'd be warm enough to move. And then I'd spend about half an hour to 45 minutes basking directly in the sun to get my body moving. And every time I was with the Indians, they kept saying, eat raw meat, that's what you need, raw meat. And after having the surgery, every time I ate meat, another reason I became vegetarian, because I liked animals, but because after the surgery, if I ate cooked meat, I broke out with huge pustulations. We're not talking about little bitty things. Anybody see Liar Liar, that James Carey film where that guy is in the hall working at his firm, and he's got this big zit on the end of his nose, and Carey just wants to squeeze it, like that. So I had those all over from my knees to my scalp. So it didn't look very pretty. It certainly didn't feel good. Each one of them hurt. So I was very afraid to eat meat. And of course, all of the dialogue that happened, from the surgery, they're saying that if I ate raw things that I would die. Of course, I didn't believe that at that point because I was eating all these raw things and getting better. So they completely did not know what they were talking about. However, when it came to meat, I was still afraid to eat the raw meat because of parasites. I was already an idiot. I wasn't going to get a brain fluke and become an idiot again. When I did stop, a few times I went back to RC Cola and donuts after 6 months of eating raw foods way back in the beginning. I did that because I had read the book Mind Over Matter, or a book about mind over matter, and I was convinced that I was developed enough that I could control my body without having to watch what I ate. So I went back to my powdered donuts and RC Cola and stuff like that, and I found myself autistic again in about 10 days. So I did that 3 times and proved to myself by experience that the body needs nutrition, especially in my body. Maybe other people don't, but I had evolved to a point where I could do mind over matter. I learned that I had to be in harmony with nature, my mind and my spirit and everything. So I continued with the diet all the way through. So at this point, they were off again. I was with the Eskimo, and they were saying what you need is raw meat. And of course, I wasn't going to do it. And they had this celebration they have every September, early September, to September. And they dug up these hides and they unwrapped them, and there was this green, black, white, brown, patinaed, moldy stuff that was rank. I mean, it smelled terribly, made me want to vomit within 5 feet of it. And the children smell it, all the natives smell it, and they're jumping up and down like it's cotton candy. And I didn't quite fathom this. And they said it's a medicine, we have it every time to fill ourselves with good energy through the winter. And I said, okay, each to their own. You know, weren't going to get me to eat that. And it didn't stink enough. It didn't stink half a mile downwind, so they re-wrapped it and buried it for another week. And then they brought it out again, it was even more rank. And then everybody started eating it. I mean, the children would eat a whole handful. And they offered me a little ping pong ball sized amount, and I got within 5 feet of it. I was literally started choking like I was going to vomit. So they got some cotton balls, or I had some cotton balls, and they put musk oil on them, they shoved them up my nose, and destroyed the odor, and then I ate a ping pong ball sized amount because they insisted. And I mean they insisted. So I ate it. I really didn't think it was meat, because I didn't know meat turned green and white and black and all that. I thought meat got worms and decomposed or dried out in the sun into leather. That's all I thought that happened to meat. I didn't know the gangrene was a mold, was a fungus and all of that, even though I had done all that research. I hadn't put the two and two together until later, and I mean much later. So I ate this, and all of a sudden I felt better. I had very little pain. I was able to get out of the sleeping bag in 45 minutes in the morning, in the direct sun for only 15 minutes, and I was moving and doing better. So I begged them to tell me what herbs they had molded. They said, no, it's raw meat and raw blubber, seal blubber, whale blubber, and or both. And I just thought they weren't going to tell this white boy, that was messing their Alaska up, any secret ingredient. So I was so weak still at that point. I had to get out of Alaska because it was getting too cold. So I was too weak to bicycle, so I hopped freight trains and bungee corded my bike to the side of the freight car and hung a hammock across the open sliding doors and watched the scenery go down through Canada and back in the United States all the way down to a desert in California near Palm Springs. And of course I had to hop quite a few trains to do that. I mean, at one point I ended up in almost in Utah, because they had gone off and I didn't know where I was going. So I had to hop trains back in California and down to Oregon and down again. So I got back to the desert and I decided I was going to fast to death because I wasn't going to deal with the pain anymore. I figured I hadn't found a cure. So I was out in the desert fasting. 2 weeks went by, and during that 2 weeks there was a den of coyotes. I picked an old Indian burial ground so people would leave me alone. A lot of times when I was traveling on the bicycle, I had a beard and long hair, and I wore robes like the time of BC, at the time Christ was around. So a lot of people left me alone. If you find Jesus in the graveyard, you don't go talk to him. You leave him alone, even if he's a hippie. So I took full advantage of that, definitely. And I spent a lot of time in graveyards where I'd be left alone. Because that was, the 70s, mid-70s, and hippies were not respected and, tortured and hurt. So as long as I went around with a robe like that and giving, them the image of Christianity, of Christ, at least they were more respectful. So I was out in the desert and I took an old Indian burial ground to fast myself to death. And there was a den of coyotes that lived up in the canyon, and they came down every night about midnight, and they sound like a bunch of crazy people in a sanitarium. And it's just the way they sound when they're together, yelping and having fun and playing with each other. So they played this game with me. It was like, can I sense where they are, when they stopped yelping and surrounding me. There were about 11 of them. When I was able to count 11 of them, just by sensing where they were, they hunted a rabbit and brought it to me. And they ripped it open, they put it at my feet. And I hadn't even eaten 6.5 years at this point, 6.5 years. And here I had the Easter bunny on my feet, bleeding. I was shivering, and I kept getting a message, this is what you need, this is what you need. And all of a sudden, this dialogue of my uncle telling my brother and his children, my cousins, when they were going rabbit hunting, how to cook the rabbit. They said if you catch a wild rabbit, you have to cook it thoroughly. It has to be burnt and not pink or white in the inside. It has to be dark on the inside because wild rabbits have an organism that will infect your body and your intestines, especially first, and it'll kill you with incredible intestinal pain within 48 hours. So that went through my head. I looked down at that rabbit and I said, 2 days, I'll be dead in 2 days, 2 days of pain, no problem. So I picked up the rabbit and I took a bite and it was raw, it was all that disgusting stuff, and it came right back up. So I thought of my home, when I was growing up and all the times I had to sit for that hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours every night trying to get down that awful food. I was going to get this rabbit down. So I psyched myself into it. It took me about 5 minutes to get back to that place. Started eating the rabbit, and after about 15 bites, it started tasting delicious. So I started devouring it like I was very hungry. And I ate about 3.5 pounds, and this is a jackrabbit, so it was about 7.5 pounds. And then the coyote shared the rest. I went back to my sleeping bag to die. Now I knew I was dying because I felt good. And the only times that I had felt good in my life was a near-death experience. I died on an operating table twice, and they revived me, and then a drug experience where my blood pressure went down. And so I knew what near-death was like. I knew that you leave the body. Once you leave the body, there's no pain. It just hovered over the body, went off into the tunnel, the white light. And the white light's so blinding, if you can't get through the white light, you don't die. So you may get a glimpse of it and stay outside, but once you enter the so-called tunnel, you don't come back, you're dead. So I'd been there and back several times, and I knew that I was dying because I felt good. So I went back to my sleeping bag, but when I woke the next morning, I was still alive, still there, in my sleeping bag, still had some pain, but it was down to 45 minutes again, just like with the Eskimos. So I was only able to get out, just lay in the sun, only 10 minutes, naked right there in the sun. Nobody else was around, just the chipmunks and the birds and hawks and ravens and stuff like that around. So I let the sun beat on me, it brought me back to life again. And that went on for 3 days. Not one cramp, not one diarrhea, no worm came out my ear, my nose, or my eye, or anywhere. So I had no problem with the rabbit, and I said, what is all this myth? Everything is a myth with the medical profession. Everything they teach you is garbage. So I got very angry again, and I started eating meat after 3 days. I said, that's it. The Indians told me raw meat was it. It works. I started eating raw meat. So at that very moment, a sidewinder rattlesnake went by me at that revelation. And I had seen Indians, just walk up and put their foot on the head of a rattlesnake and pick it up in front of the rattle, take it and snap the head off, peel it back and eat it. Now, in all the North and Central and South American Indians, natives, the snake is your most prized medicinal food. I mean, they revere it. They even cook it, but you don't have to. You can take the snake and wrap it in a glass jar and let it sit for 6 months, and all the snake oil will come out. And a teaspoon of that snake oil will relieve all of any kind of rheumatic and arthritic symptoms, usually within 2 hours. That's where you get snake oil, tails from. It was for real, but people were getting a mineral oil and putting a little snake oil in it and selling it as snake oil. So you've gotten the myth that snake oil is all nonsense. Well, it's not. So at that moment, without thinking, I had that revelation, and I went up and put my bare foot right on the rattlesnake's head, picked it up in front of the rattler and started whipping it around and said, oh my God, what am I doing? I've never done this. I'm swinging that thing around. I picked it up with the other hand. I'm getting tired, aching, my bones are aching, and I'm afraid, that if I go like that, it's going to come back and bite me. So I said, okay, well, it's one way or die or another. So snapped it, and sure enough, the head went right off, peeled it back all of a sudden all these cats showed up from neighboring farms, that were at least a half a mile away. And they shared the rattlesnake with me. I started feeling better and better. So I started, eating anything I could out in the desert. I got scorpions and break off the poison gland, and tarantulas, break off the poison gland, and eat anything I could. Trap birds and chipmunks, and there wasn't enough food out there. So I got on my bicycle and went down to the farms and made deals. Like if I milked the cows or the goats and cleaned up the stalls and stuff and worked, I could get all the food I wanted. So in 3 months, I went from 113 pounds to 150 pounds. I looked like a scaled down Arnold Schwarzenegger by eating all this raw dairy and raw meat. And I didn't eat a lot of raw meat. I probably ate meat 3 days a week, but most of it was raw dairy and lots of butter and honey. And I went back to Los Angeles to spread the word, and they said, "Raw meat, are you crazy? Raw milk, are you crazy? And you get a brain fluke and you'll die." And I said, "Well, I've been there and done that." So I said, "I have to continue doing what I'm doing that works. It makes me feel better." So I continue to this day eating raw meat and raw dairy as my main sustenance. I don't eat any vegetables. I eat drink vegetable juices. And I will explain all of that when we get into the next phase, which is the workshop. And then if you come for the free lecture and haven't signed up for the workshop, in the workshop what I'm going to do is, it's usually in a workshop there's some kind of interaction between you and the speaker, but your activity in the workshop will be to stay awake and pay attention. That's why I call it a workshop. Usually I can keep you pretty awake, but it's your job to stay awake. So that's the workshop. I'm going to tell you how your body works, chemically how it reacts, why I think you should eat what I think that you should eat based on the physiology, biochemistry, and anatomy of the body, and how it works empirically, whereas what I call my experience in the first place. I don't tell you anything that wasn't learned from experience. I didn't do anything head work first. If it worked physiologically, that's what showed me as wisdom and truth. And then if I talk to you about science, it's only the science that I've learned afterward to convince all of those heady people, that there is some science that validates everything that I say. So when we finish, then after we talk about the body, then I'll talk about foods, how they react in the body in combinations, how we utilize them, how we digest them, then how to eat in a day to keep your mind physically, mentally, intellectually, emotionally attentive and calm throughout every day. And it's definitely a pattern of eating. And when you leave here, you're going to understand your body. You'll never be afraid of it in the way that you were before. You will never doubt it in the way that you had before. You will never have to run to a doctor unless you've torn off your leg or broken it or something like that and need some mechanic, because that's what they are, mechanics, to put you back together. Okay? So thank you for coming. Is there anybody who just came for the free lecture? Everybody's already signed up for the workshop? My gosh, this is the first. Okay, terrific. We're going to take a break, a 15-minute break, eat something, because it's going to be an hour and a half to 2 hours before we take our next break, and then that'll be a 15 to 20-minute break. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Please watch your timepieces. We'll try to do this in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Less active on the flower. They only need to get enough to fuel their own flight, and then they're off looking for nests.
And are any of these native species producing honey also, or are they making this nectar pollen mix on?
The only bee that could eat this native that could be sort of thought about as a honey producer in this area would be bumblebees, and that's not of a commercially viable sort, because the structure is difficult to work with. It's underground often, or in small numbers, but they do store honey. And the amazing thing about the honeybee with respect to honey, why does it store honey? It's social and it's perennial. The honey that a honeybee produces for itself is basically produced to get a huge honey crop by the end of the season.